Martin, here we are in a study that's being
Shush.
retidied, and I'm feeling a little bit kind of like squeezed between various pieces of furniture and boxes.
But people can't see those.
Matthew 5:13 to 20, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most extended piece of teaching in Matthew's Gospel. So what do you make of this particular passage?
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, just thinking about the location of this passage. So this is salt and light, and then it's righteousness exceeding that of the Pharisees, and the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And it comes right after the Beatitudes, and right before Jesus talks about a number of the commandments about murder, about adultery, and so forth.
Oaths and all of that.
A number of the commandments, and takes them and pushes them a huge step further. And we know enough about Matthew and his composition of the gospel to know that if he puts something up front, he's saying this is really important. So he said the Beatitudes are really important. Now he's saying this curious collection of sayings. So they don't all hang together, but he's saying this is really important. So it's with that kind of view that I come to this passage. What is he saying to us that is so important? And I think, I mean, you look at the salt and light sayings, and they are sayings that the commentators have a field day trying to figure out what they might mean. I think there is a fairly straightforward meaning that is rooted in what we've already discovered about Matthew's Gospel, which he is intent on a positive development of disciples, and both reflected in how he treats the disciples, the 12 in the Gospel, and reflected in how he, as it were, speaks to the disciples of his own church, of his own congregation, and therefore through them to us. So you've got this, I think, it's an image we use a lot, isn't it? But compelling image that we are to be salt and light, and that means that we somehow are in the world. And so I think it's an important point about Matthew is that he's not talking to people who were withdrawn from the world. We are in the world, and we are to be salt and light in the world, and in that way to bear Christ in the world. And of course we are having this conversation at the Feast of Candlemas. So when we think of light, we think of Christ, and Matthew is saying you need to think about yourself being a conduit for that light.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. So this is he's signaling at the very beginning, as he does with the Beatitudes, that this is about our discipleship. Then this whole piece about, and again, quite sort of convoluted piece about fulfilling the law, about righteousness exceeding that of the Pharisees. And what's he saying there about, is this, he's not saying that the law is replaced. He's quite clear about that. But nor is he saying that the adherence to the law in the way it is adhered to by the Pharisees is sufficient. And the clue to what he means by fulfillment is, in terms of application to us, is then given in those sayings that appear after.
Yeah.
But what does he mean when he says Jesus is the fulfill? Jesus has come to fulfill. I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets. And I go back to the other starting point in Matthew's Gospel, the very starting point, which is the genealogy. And, the genealogy is there because it is for Matthew really important. There's a message in this. And when you look at the threefold structure of the genealogy and you look at the very last piece, you see that Jesus is come to be the Messiah and therefore the fulfillment of the aspirations, the longings, the hopes of the people of Israel. And so Jesus is fulfilling the law by being who he is. And it's not, therefore, fulfilling the law in saying, in the way in which he observes it. It is the fulfilling by being himself. And then going on to saying how we participate in that fulfillment in the way in which, later on, we take the commandments and, as it were, not look at the letter, but at the spirit. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah, that does make sense. So, picking up a few of those points. So the first one, salt. We're to be salt and light. And that metaphor, you can stretch metaphors, but what does salt do? Salt brings out the flavour, doesn't it? It brings out the full flavour. And it also prevents corruption and decay.
It preserves, doesn't it?
Preserves. So both of those things is what we are called to as followers of Jesus, set around the person of Jesus, to bring out the full savour and delight of this world and to prevent corruption and decay. And he goes on in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount to talk about the ways of behaving that do that. But one of the interesting things about salt, or other metaphors that he uses like yeast, is the point is not to make the world salt.
Yeah, exactly.
The point is not to make a salt desert of the world. And as he talks about in the parable of the sower elsewhere, there will be people who hear and are salt, and there will be people who aren't, to the end of the age, until the coming of the kingdom. So we must understand that this metaphor already tells us realistically, we will always be a minority in what we are endeavouring to do in embodying and participating.
And it would taste awful if we weren't.
Oppressive. And you're right. He says he talks about this idea about I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfil the law, which is fulfilled in and of himself. I wonder if also, as some commentators say, there's also part of what he's doing. He's reassuring and then unreassuring his listeners, because he's just talked about all these people who are blessed, the meek, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and the such like. And they're probably thinking, wait a minute, what about the law? We've been pursuing this all our lives, and now you're turning around and telling these people who mourn are blessed, who don't know the first thing about the law. So he's then saying, no, the law's really important. I've come to fulfill the law. But then again, he then disabuses them of thinking that it's the Pharisees and the scribes who are those who kept the law, by saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And that must have been a fairly devastating thing to say, because it's like saying, you've got to play football better than Lionel Messi. You've got to swear more than whoever that chef was who swears a lot of the time. I can't remember. But because the scribes and the Pharisees, their behavioural righteousness is not to be underestimated. Gordon Ramsay, that was a man, was not to be underestimated. But then, as you say, he goes on to explicate what that looks like. So when, for instance, he goes on to talk about thou shalt not murder, he says, actually, even to harbour anger and bitterness and resentment in your heart towards your neighbour is already to become unstuck. And psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Nobody was killed with a bullet who wasn't first killed with a word, who wasn't first killed with a thought. So what he seems to me to be illustrating is the nature of the kingdom heart, which we see perfectly in himself, which we are called to embody ourselves.
And for which Matthew, and when we see through all the Gospels, is summed up in the word love. That actually... the command, what is the greatest commandment? Well, Matthew 22, we find out, and that brings us back. Then reflect back to these passages and think, okay, so when Jesus is talking about this, he's talking about fulfillment as embodied love. He's talking about the command to not kill, but then you harbour anger. What is that? That's about the depth of love. Simply not murdering someone doesn't mean you love them.
No, yeah. The question he's saying is, I'm not really interested in whether you killed them or not, because I know you didn't kill them. But what I'm interested in is, would you have wanted to? Because that ain't very loving, if you would. So how do we develop these kingdom hearts, these loving hearts? And the denouement for me in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, is in the middle, unlike most of our sermons, which comes right at the end, because the denouement in the middle is
apart from those that just trail off.
Apart from those who dribble off and are abandoned. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and its righteousness, right in the middle there. Because this seems to me to be all about what it is to be participating in the kingdom of love, the kingdom of God, here and now, which Jesus says is available to us in and through him.